Hello, amazing New Mexico Literary Landscape students. Welcome to week 3. This week, we're going to be diving into La Conquista, um, and the focus of how the voices of the colonial Southwest ended up being very influential for like even things like New Mexico culture, or New Mexican culture, as well as the art forms that come along with it. But it's also the critiques of it um, as well as the benefits. So I think it's important to kind of talk about that too. Um, but yeah, and so you're gonna dive into new reading this week too. And that's from Enrique La Madrid, Tesoros. Um, treasures, right? And so you're gonna be knocking out one of the chapters. Not really hard reading. I'll explain that in a little bit either. Mostly like written works, either pertaining to that time or from that time. Um, and so I'll be talking about that. Um, one of the things that's pretty interesting about this is there's like a wild history that is attached to it. And of course, being a history person that I am, I include that in this as well. And so um be prepared um to get a little bit of that in here too. But yeah, so we will be discussing that kind of stuff as well. Um and I look forward to like um the assignment this week because it's always fun to do something like that's a little bit less um how would you say it, rigid and like um typical, I guess. So I'm excited to get you guys to actually just like do a little bit more writing that's different. But yeah, let's get into it. All right. And so like I said, we are diving into the La Conquista, and we'll be also kind of discussing how um sorry, I need to readjust my stuff over here. Okay, there we go. Um we'll also be discussing how this time period was very influential for what ends up being our culture here in New Mexico. And that means also like not just literature, but other art forms as well. And so I'll kind of dive into that a little bit too. But let's get to the historical context first. And so La Conquista was kind of an interesting time period for a lot of people globally. But here in the Southwest and in Mexico, and other places, it was very much um a big change, right? And so people going from having a certain way of life to being um inundated and taught and influenced by um different nations from around the world. Um and so when you talk about the indigenous peoples and stuff like that too, you see that occur. But and I'll go into more detail with that too. But the fact is that this was happening globally, and this is just one example of it here in the Southwest, and including Mexico and other places, right? I like, once again, like referring to that whole frame of New Mexico literary landscapes is New Mexico literary landscapes and beyond. Why? Because much of what happened during those time periods were a direct connection to what occurs here in the Southwest, in New Mexico in particular. And so that's another element that I like to bring into it too, because sometimes we tend to disregard that. We think of only like where we got to here, and like even in the more modern sense, or modern context, right? But really, there was a bunch of other stuff that occurred even before that that kind of got the wheels turning, if you will, right? And so I like explaining that part too, because it gives us a little bit more perspective. And then it also offers us the opportunity to see how like things that occurred ended up influencing how our history was changed, or our history was played out, I should say, sorry, um, during colonial New Spain, right, or colonial New Mexico, or whatever you want to call it. Um, but first, it's important to kind of discuss some of the other stuff too, or the buildup for it, if you will, right? And so La Conquista starts um, because of this idea of expanding um, Spain's territory, right, or Spanish territory. And this was happening all over, like I said, like the French are doing it, the English are doing it. Obviously, we've heard of that. Um, and so it was important to like use that as a goal for um, increasing the empire's wealth, but also acquiring resources, right? And then also spreading um, the culture to different places, and within that culture, we see things like um, ways of life, uh, religion, um, language, all that stuff, right? And so that's another part of it. So in order to understand that and see where they came from with this in regard to the Spanish in particular, because that's who was here, right? We have to understand like how it started. And so the expansion of Spanish territory occurred under the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile, sorry, or Queen of Castile, and her husband, King Ferdinand, or King of Aragon, or Aragon. Um, and so basically what happened is when they got married, it marked the beginning of the Spanish power beyond the Iberian Peninsula. And you have to remember before this, like the Moors or the Muslims, right, or the people of Islam uh had control for hundreds of years in Spain. And so this was a big deal because now they were able to expand the empire out of that, and also try to, and we all heard this before, but try to purge that from Spanish society or Spanish culture. Even though like there's no way they could because it was too embedded at that point after hundreds of years, right? And so that was something that was pretty interesting too. The other part of it too was much of the expansion of the Spanish Empire, because you have to remember this is like a newer empire, right? And so usually with newer empires, there's not, it's just like a new nation, there's not a lot of money. And so much of the funding in regard to supporting Isabella's and Ferdinand's um expansion of the Spanish Empire, most of it was funded through the Vatican. And that's where we see, and you guys remember learning about this in the past, was uh the three G's, right? So it was like gold, God, and glory. Um, and so that was the whole momentum of it, right? Or the whole idea was to acquire those things. And it was like pretty much in that order, like God, I mean gold. It was in this sort of gold, glory, then God, right? And so the gold was like the main thing they were looking for. So riches, um, were a big part of it. And so going to these other places to try to discover and find these things. I shouldn't say discover because like they were already there, but to discover them for themselves, I guess you would say, and find these things and also the resources too, because you have to remember like uh, the countries of Europe or nations of Europe were at war for hundreds of years. Even like if you really break it down, like thousands of years, some of these people have been fighting and utilizing their resources like crazy. So of course they want to gather them as well, right? And so that was kind of an interesting component of it, is that there was these primary ideas or goals they had set, right? One of them was acquiring gold. The glory is acquiring the land too. So like saying like getting that Spanish flag, like we see even here, like with Christopher Columbus, like this like wild, like I think it's so funny to see this painting and how like angelic it is, or like stuff like that too, right? And it's even dramatic. Like this guy's like grabbing the rock to pull the like boat to the land. or hug the land. I don't know. He's doing something like that, right? Um, but yeah, like claiming the land for Spain, right? Claiming the land for France, claiming the land for Britain. Um, and why? Because it's that idea of expanding the empire, right? Getting it to another place, taking over a different land, right? Acquiring the resources with that land. Um, and so that was another thing. Um, but then also embedded in that is the people, right? We can see like the indigenous peoples here in the corner. Um, and so that was also a thing too. So uh when you tie down the ideas of colonialism and imperialism, um, to what they actually were focused on, and a lot of it was economic, right? So once again, like the gold, the or riches, right? Any kind of jewels, all that stuff, right? But also the land that they're acquiring because all of the resources that are attached to it, and new stuff that wasn't in Europe, like you talk about a number of things like minerals and stuff like that that were not there, that now could be taken over there and exported for profit, right? And then also acquiring another workforce too. Like that's something we can't deny. Like indigenous peoples in these areas were here, and then later on when they had the encomienda system, um, and other forms, it ends up being like a type of slavery, if you will. And so even whenever when they acquire the land and are deeded it by the Spanish, or given the land from the Spanish crown, granted the land, like it also included the people that were living there. And so like they become basically like rulers of those small areas, right? And so they end up becoming the indigenous people end up becoming subjects, or and many times are enslaved, right? And so that was a workforce for them, right? So cultivating new resources required some sort of workforce. So that was another thing. But then they came like God, which was the other G, right? And that was the conversion of people globally to Christianity, in this case Catholicism, which ends up being like a huge influence here with us in New Mexico, right? Most of us were brought up in the Catholic Church. Um, and so or if not, like our parents were, grandparents, stuff like that too. And so that was also a way to get uh the indigenous peoples to kind of go along with the new culture that was being implemented in the locale or geographic location they were in. But one thing about it was when that occurred, many things happened, obviously. Um, so anything from like really examples of genocide and ethnocide, where they were killing off, people because they were um from these groups, like when you hear about Hispaniola or Dominican Republic and Haiti, uh the Taino people were that were living there were completely killed off. Um and a lot of it was because they didn't want to convert to Catholicism, or they didn't want to become enslaved peoples. And so then the Spanish brought in enslaved peoples from Western Africa. Um, but those are examples like in the Caribbean, right, where we see that occur, and even in places like Cuba and places like that, who end up having a direct connection to many of the places that we discuss now in regard to even like New Mexico history, right? And so that's another thing. Um, and so the direct connection to that is like coming into the Caribbean, like we saw with um Christopher Columbus and those folks, and then establishing communities there, or settlements or colonies, um, to expanding out to other places within Central, South America, and even North America, where we see like in the Gulf of Mexico and places like that, right? So Florida and all those places get hit up too. But one example is that idea of like Mesoamerica or Central America, being one of the steps that they get to, right? So it's like cross the Atlantic, hit the Caribbean, whatever you want to call it, then make their way to the next stop, which would be like Mexico, South America, um, and even like I said, North America. So it's like a progression, right? And then from Mexico, they come up north into the Southwest, in places like New Mexico, Arizona, California, Texas, all of those places, and then even expanding out even further. And same thing with France, going up to the Gulf too, and then the British going on to the eastern part of the United States. Um, and so we see that as a thing, right? Um, and there's like numerous examples of that. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but I want to kind of like go in like a sequential order of when it happened. And so, like I said, like with Christopher Columbus makes that first stop there in the Caribbean, lost, right? Like don't even know where he's at. Uh, um, but then they run into this land and they find these people, right? And they're like the New World. Um, so that occurs. But the other thing about it is that there was a like I said, that progression to like where we even get to like our influences here even in New Mexico, which takes a couple hundred years, right? To actually be established like we think about it today. Um, but before that, they stop in different areas, right? Um, and along the way, when they're in the Southwest and then in in Mexico and Central America, um, they go and interact with the Mayan people, uh, and the Mexica or the Aztecas. Um, and it's kind of a interesting environment, I would say, during that time because there's a lot of like distrust, I guess, but also like um curiosity, I guess you would say. And so that was something that kind of fueled the interactions between these two groups, right? But the whole goal of it, like when you talk about Hernan Cortez, it wasn't about like, oh, let's see what the people are like. You know, it was like, let's take over, right? We're gonna go in there and this is gonna be our land now. And at first he was like gonna claim it for himself, right? He was like, nah, how with the Spanish? I'm gonna claim this for myself. And then later on, after things progress, he kind of changes his mind and is like, yes, this is Spain, right? And he's given like notoriety and stuff like that for it. Um, but while that's occurring and those interactions are happening, we see this kind of interesting dynamic that occurs there, right? In the way of like trading of knowledge too, trading of culture, things like that, which are very interesting when you actually like break them down. And of course, during that time is when we start to see that instance of like art forms and stuff like that also playing a part of it too. So like poetry, narratives, storytelling, stuff like that, music, end up being something that they kind of trade with each other, and I'll kind of explain that more as we progress through this, right? Um, but in the end, like there's two different ways you could look at it. And so there's a way, and this is something that I've always like kind of found kind of interesting too, being a Nuevo Mexicano as well, is like this idea of like there's two different examples of like how this probably could have went down. I don't know which one is true in my case with my heritage, right? Because of course, like I have both of these in me, right? Like the blood of the indigenous peoples and the blood of the Spanish flows through my veins, right? And even the blood of the African enslaved person that was with the Spanish, right? Brought with the Spanish, uh, flows through my veins, right? And so there's a couple ways that it's broken down. And so if you think about it, there's two different options that we have. This, where we see everything's kind of peaceful. Maybe there's like a this example of people that are just like, well, we would like to get to know you better. We would like to get to know you better. And this interaction that occurs in a peaceful manner, um, where the culture comes together because of of positivity. Um, or what we think a lot in regard to the reality of it is that it was like straight up warfare and battles, and things were fought for. um the existence of people were fought for, the spread of certain things like cultural components like religion and things like that are also um uh fought for in order to kind of spread. And here we have those examples, right? Where we have the Spanish and the Mexica or the Aztecas fighting, right? In a gruesome battle too. It's not like it was a really simple thing, right? Um, and so we get these examples um of what it kind of went down like. And so um based off of texts and things like that, which is the next point too, is that we see or hear about and read about um these instances, right? Where there were some that were kind of like this, and then there was a lot that were like this too, right? And so we get to understand the historical components of it because of what? The writings, right? And so I know I talked a lot about all this stuff and I'm going to continue to talk more, but we get it because of the writings. Like the chroniclers, the Spanish chroniclers were the ones that recorded these accounts, right? Some of the Mexica and other people too, the Mayan people also chronicled, right? And so we get these stories, and sometimes it's not written, sometimes it's just stories from told from firsthand accounts by people um uh in in areas where they're just kind of sharing their story, right? And so um those are another thing too, right? And those get passed down too and spread throughout different places based off the fact that many of them were recorded detailed accounts, but were done through word of mouth, right? Um, and so that was another thing too. And so we have these different examples of that. And then eventually it's going to lead up into other things too, like like pieces of poetry, plays, songs, all this stuff, right? And so that's what's kind of wild about this time period is we get to see that start to happen real early, but mostly with the chroniclers. They're the ones that are like taking note of all this stuff, right? And so I want to talk about these a little bit too, because it's important to kind of understand uh, where we come from in regard to like some of this stuff, and especially regarding those interactions, right? And also like where we saw changes occur, right? And Toshikat massacre was one of them. This happened in 1520. Um, and so a couple years after we first hear about the Spanish making their way over to this to the uh, Central America. Um, and so what happened was the Spanish conquistadors um, attacked the indigenous and I'm sorry, Spanish conquistadors and their allies, who were other indigenous people, who were upset at the Mexica too, because of taking over their land and stuff like that too. Because we have to remember, like, it kind of not kind of, it did happen in these areas too, right? Um, and so once again, those nations fighting for resources and things like that too, right? And so they go and attack the Mexica during the Toshikat festival. Uh, and what happened is they were doing ceremony, right? And like in Mexica culture and Mayan culture, they were all about um, music, right? As ceremony. So music was a big part of it. So whenever they would do drumming and they do stuff like that, it was all based off of being able to um, really um, connect with the spirits, right? And so that's what they did. So they worked hard to make this connection with the spirits through music a lot of times, right? So these art forms were used, right? Songs were sung, poetry was written and read, all this different stuff, right? So what ended up happening is they were having ceremony, and drumming is part of it, right? Those drums, the wet-wets, the big drums like this, and then we have the teponatzli. They are all sacred instruments, right? And so they're even some of these drums, not some of them, the wet-wet and the teponatzli are seen as like even like a spirit itself, right? Or an entity. And so what ends up happening is the Spanish conquistadors go in there, the drummers are drumming, and they know how important it is, right? The conquistadores by this point, because they've already been there for a little while. They know what this means. Well, they go in there and they hack off the drummer's hands. And you have to remember too, the drummers are seen kind of like almost as like medicine men or like shaman, if you will, right? Because they are the ones um playing the instrument to connect to the spirits, right? Playing the sacred instrument. And so everyone loses their minds, right? But the thing that's crazy is like, and these are from this is cool because they have like firsthand accounts of this um in different from different chroniclers from both sides, which is pretty interesting too. And they both say right as soon as they got the Spanish cut off those dudes' arms, the drummer's arms, another person just ran over there and boom, 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 right, to play the instrument, to stay keep that connection. Same thing happens to them, and it ends up being this pretty wild um battle. And so hundreds of people are killed during this massacre on May 22nd, 1520. And this kind of was the beginning of the end of the Mexica too, or I shouldn't say end because like we're still around, but it was it was what incited the war that ends up leading to the taking or capturing of Tenochtitlan, right? Or Mexico's what is Mexico City now, right? And so that happens because of that. And that was kind of wild thing too. And so going back to the idea, or the other thing too is like we see Spanish attacking pueblos too, and this is going to be a little bit later. And I want to kind of brush on this in a little bit, and I guess I'll come back to this slide. But just like to give you an idea of like why this is important too, because this kind of set things up for what inevitably be um the opportunity for them to keep moving north, right? But capturing place by place. But we see the art forms there too, once again, that were popular during this time. And it happened to be this moment whenever something really bad happened, right? Um, and sad. Um, and then the other thing too is like after this occurs, we get to see uh individuals being persecuted for practicing some of these art forms. So the drumming now is gone. Like we can't do that anymore. Like that's not allowed. And once the Spanish Inquisition comes in and is the one who really like polices this, I guess. I mean, some people could be put to death or beaten or tortured for playing a drum or for singing those sacred songs, right? And this starts in the Caribbean, makes its way here into Mexico, right? Into Central America, Guatemala, and places like that. And then it's going to just keep moving up north, right? But La Conquista had that embedded within it. Okay. Like as someone who has the heritage of both, right? Like this is something that is sad to hear and it makes me feel kind of bad, but it's also needed. And so describing this is important. And why? Because like the Spanish chroniclers and what ends up being some of the other chroniclers in what ends up being called New Spain were writing all this down. Why? Because they wanted to have an account of all of this stuff. Like that was one of the requirements from the Spanish crown and the Vatican was they wanted to have these accounts and everything chronicled so we can understand what happened here and keep it as as history, right? And that was pretty wild. So one thing too was that the Inquisition was really harsh in regard to dealing with some of these things. And a lot of these people that would participate in this stuff were seen as like participating in witchcraft and all this crazy stuff, right? And so that was real, like that was real stuff. It really happened. Um it wasn't uncommon for people to be tortured because of their beliefs and because of their connection to their indigenous cultures, um, by the Spanish Inquisition. And so some were put to death, some were just tortured, not just, but some were tortured, right? Um, as well. And some were stripped of dignity and stuff like that too. Which was always is always hard to talk about. And like the chroniclers wrote all this down, and we see pictures and drawings or woodcuts of this. Why? Because like that's what they wanted. That's some people's jobs were just to do that, right? A lot of times it was uh um monks and friars and people like that that were in the church who were also sent here to like spread the word of God as well, or to convert people, the indigenous peoples to Christianity or Catholicism. But they were also there to chronicle everything, to write everything down, say what happened, what did the what did places look like. Even the people that were considered like explorers did the same thing. They were required to keep really detailed diaries and journals and stuff like that too. Probably journals because diary sounds so juvenile, but like journal accounts of what's going on, right? And so that's what they did. And so luckily, a lot of those were kept well and protected, and so that's why we have what we have today. Even though like much of the stuff that was from the indigenous groups were destroyed, um, some of the and I love this too is like um, some of the Franciscan priests and friars and stuff like that too uh recognize the importance of those things, and so they hid them, right? Like I remember reading a really cool account. There's a wonderful book. It's not wonderful like, oh, it's so beautiful, like it's just like got really great information called Ambivalent Conquest, and it's uh firsthand accounts of people, of indigenous people from the Mayan uh group who described their what it was like when the Spanish came and the Inquisition was there. Um, Mostly the Inquisition, and it's wild. Like it's an amazing book called Ambivalent Conquest. I always forget to like do some of the first-hand accounts, um, or scan them in so we can see them. Now I'll remember, but that one's excellent, and it gives a lot of this stuff. And they talk about how some of the priests were even like getting hiding under their cloak, so that they couldn't be destroyed, right? Or wouldn't be destroyed, and that's what they did, and they tried to save those things. But then others just chronicled what happened, and they were like, yeah, like this is what happened, and we were cool with it too, you know. And so like there's a lot of that, and it's pretty wild. I'm gonna read some of the chronicles too, that people laid out. So there's gonna be several people who are not, but I want to talk about these like kind of images too. um so some of these things that we see um occur here even make their way up north, even into New Mexico, which we see occur, and the Spanish Inquisition comes up here too. And kind of the same thing happens to the Pueblo people and the Ne and the Apache and Comanche people, who are residing here as well, like having a very similar experience in regard to being seen as heretics and all this wild stuff, even participating in witchcraft, uh, because of the Inquisition, right? And so the strict rules that were there, because you have to remember, like all that same stuff that was going down there, they were doing up here too. So like drumming, ceremony, and all that stuff too. So that was true. So the reason I wanted to talk about it now too, and I'll kind of brush on it again in a little bit, was the fact that we uh we have remnants of it too that still lingers here, and so that's kind of an interesting thing. But one of the things that was crazy is, and I like sharing this story too, is I was in Italy. Last time was in 2008. uh I know that was like a long time ago, but it was still cool. And so I was there in 2008, and we went to Assisi, Italy, which is where St. Francis is from, right? And so we go there and we see like uh the cathedral and all this beautiful stuff. It's beautiful. It's like this beautiful little town or village, like in on a mountain, like on the mountain. And the mountain isn't high. It's almost like what we consider like a hill, right? But it's in the Tuscan Valley. So there's all this like cool stuff, right? Like all around. Like you had to pass through like this huge pastura or whatever. And then there was like covered with sunflowers. And then you walk up to the city, and it's cobblestone streets and all this stuff, right? Beautiful, right? And so we go there and check it out, my wife and I, and then uh we're walking and there's this like torture museum. And those of you who have been with me before, like I'm like, I love that kind of stuff. I love learning about those kind of things, and I'm always drawn to learning about those things too. And so of course I'm like, let's go there. And so we go to the torture museum. It was predominantly um relics and artifacts from the Spanish Inquisition during this time. And so we're walking around checking all this stuff, and there was this like grill that was made out of wrought iron. Those of you that know what wrought iron is, it's like what we see on the windows sometimes here in Burke, right? Like to protect people from breaking in and stuff, right? And so there was this wrought iron grill that was pretty big, like a table around maybe like a foot and a half from the ground. And then I was reading about it, and what they did is like when people were being put to the question or being questioned for being heretics or whatever, they would throw them on the grill and like grill like grilling. Like you heard that people say like, oh, we're gonna grill you. Like you hear that like when people are gonna grill you to ask you questions, stuff like that. That's where that comes from. Apparently, I didn't know that at the time. And then like it was like a light bulb went off, right? And so I was like, oh shit, like this is some wild stuff, right? Craziest shit though is like when you go and you see like artifacts in a museum, right? And it has those little placards or plaques right underneath it saying like where it's from, what year it's from, what it's made out of, all that stuff. It's all um grilling torture device utilized by the Spanish Inquisition. Guess where it was from? Santa Fe, New Mexico. And so all the way across the world they have this artifact that's from this time period where we saw that, right? And for me, that was like, whoa, like being being a Nuevo Mexicano, right? And being across the world and then see it still seeing like remnants of that other places. And even like I don't think I've ever seen anything like that here, but I saw it in Italy, in Assisi, Italy, right? And a lot of it was addressing like their whole thing was like addressing the atrocities that happened there. That's what the museum was about. And so it was kind of interesting to be there and experience that. But yeah, so we saw that piece, that element of the Conquista there. But we've also the thing about it is like later I read about stuff like that too, right? And that was a wild thing. And not and I had read about other stuff, but not the grill, right? And that's where I see that. So let's talk about the chroniclers too. So we had several different chroniclers like Francisco Lopez de Gomorra, Hernan Cortez, Bernal Diaz de Castillo, Francisco Aguilar, and Andres de Tapia. Give me 1 second, please. Lo siento. Sorry, one of my students was asking me something, came in here. So we had these chroniclers, right? And so their whole goal were to capture this information. Most of them were Spanish soldiers, but others were also priests or monks and friars, like I said before. They were all given land um, and native as a reward for the works that they did as with these positions. And so, of course, some of them are very biased, I guess you would say, right? And some of them are also very like open, right? And unbiased. And that's one thing that's kind of cool too. So there were good guys and there were like bad guys, right? It just depends on what side of the Inquisition they're on, right? And I think a lot of us can agree with that. Um, and so I wanted to share some of the stuff that they had written. And so this is from Bernardo Diaz del Castillo, the guy in the middle, and he said, "We came to serve God and to get rich, as all men wish to do." That was like what he said about like why they came to the New World, right? The New World. Um, Most of the Indians, he said, particularly those living on the coast and the hotter climates, were given to unnatural lust to such a dreadful degree that they practiced that men even went out in female garments and made a livelihood by their diabolical and cursed lewdness. And so there was a lot of that in a lot of the chronicles. And so that was another interesting element of it, even bringing up like parts of culture like that too, which is kind of wild. And then we have Francisco Lopez de Gomarra, um, where he said, while the Spanish were in Tlaxcala, a great plague broke out. Oh, sorry, wrong one. I'm getting ahead of myself, my bad. When the natives asked Cortez why the Spanish were so covetous of gold, he replied, "I and my companions suffer from a sickness of the heart that can only be cured with gold." And so he was one of the chroniclers that was with um Cortez when a lot of this was going down for years. Um then we had some other accounts too. This one's actually from another book called The Broken Spears. I always forget the author's name. My bad, but this is an Aztec account of it. And so this one's kind of wild too because we get to see this too. And it was actually saved because one of the Spanish monks kept it hidden, um, and he's actually the one that wrote it and down. I can't remember his name, so my apologies. But he said while the Spaniards were in Texclala, a great plague broke out here in Tenochtitlan. It began to spread during the 13th month and lasted for 70 days, striking everywhere in the city and killing vast number of our people. Sores erupted on our faces, our breasts, our bellies, and were covered with agonizing sores from head to toe. The illness was so dreadful that no one could walk or move. The sick were utterly helpless, that they could only lie on their beds like corpses, unable to move their limbs and or even their heads. They could not lie face down or roll from side to side. They did, if they did move their bodies, they screamed with pain. A great number of men died from the plague, and many others died from hunger. They could not get up to search for food, and everyone else was too sick to care for them, so they starved to death in their beds. Some people came down with milder form of the disease. They suffered less than others and made a good recovery, but they could not escape entirely. Their looks were ravaged, for wherever the sore broke out, it gouged an ugly potch mark in their skin, and a few of the survivors were left completely blind. And so that was like just the example of like the plague that was brought with it too, right? And so we saw or we read the chroniclers' messages, and that's a big part of like how we understand these things. And sometimes it was like letters home too that we captured and are now part of like the historical accounts that we have in regard to this time period. And that was something that like is literary works, right? Those are pieces of those are narratives that are shared, right? And just like these folks shared here, these guys shared here, those same accounts end up being how we are able to kind of better understand the context of this time period, right? So moving along, there was some other things too that came here too. But before I get there, I want to kind of go back to this and the Spanish being here and moving their way up north, right? And so once they took over Mexico, gradually they keep moving north and north and north. And at first, it's all done through exploration, and so these people would go up and kind of explore the areas and say whether or not this was a good area to take over and move people to. And so we all hear the stories, right? most of us that were born here in New Mexico uh have learned in New Mexico history and other classes about those people that came up here and did those things. Mostly people from Spain, right? Or what ended up being New Spain, because some of them were actually born here too. Um, and so, or in Mexico, right? And so we hear those stories, right? And I'm gonna kind of dive into a few of them here, but so the Spanish, they make their way up north. Um, Before they get here, and this is one thing that people don't gather either, is there's like 22 um indigenous groups that still reside here in New Mexico. Um, 19 of them are pueblos, right? And the other three are Apache, Dene, and there's some Comanche people here, but two different groups of Apache. And then so we have those groups here, but mostly the Pueblo people. And so one thing that you have to understand too, pre-contact or before um the Spanish came to this area, there were over 100 Pueblos. And so that's a vast amount of people. Like even here in Albuquerque, there was a couple, like we have like Sandia and Isleta and even Acoma and Laguna to the west of us, right? But like in Albuquerque, like the Tigwe people, and then other groups too, right? That were just here. And then that's not also counting the Hinizaros too, that were living in the areas that's buffer zones later after contact occurs. Okay. Um, but yeah, there was a large group of people, amount of people here that were living here. And these different pueblos, like even like Pecos had a pueblo too. So there was all these different pueblos all around. And then after that, it kind of gets broken down into smaller ones, right? It also happened to have like 5 different language groups that are major language groups too that we still have today, and that's like Tiwa, Tewa, Towa, Keris, and Zuni. But then we also had Piro and Tano, which were pre-contact, and then they ended up dying off um, because of that. But uh, before all that happens, we have to remember like the historical elements of it too, and like how we get information about this area. And I love telling this story, um, and a lot of you guys know it already too, but just like reiterating it as some of us are not from here in our class, right? And so and that's a tale of Cabeza de Vaca, right? And Cabeza de Vaca was a Spanish soldier, explorer, right? Who was going to leaving Cuba to go to Florida, what is now Florida, right? And they had a crazy storm and their ship became shipwrecked, right? And there was only a few of them that survived. Well, what they did is they made a raft. This was in 1528. So like what, 8 years after the this massacre, they make their way on a raft, right? And then the raft ends up uh going moving along the Gulf of Mexico and then landing in Galveston, Texas. Um, and so Cabeza de Vaca and the other few people that survived with him uh ended up roaming around the area of Texas and then what would be New Mexico and those areas, right? And then finally, after around 8 years, like in 1536, they landed up running into they landed up they ended up running into I just went all Nuevo Mexicano to my blood, sorry. They ended up running into other Spanish folks, right? And were rescued and taken back to Mexico City. Well, during his account, which ended up being written down and recorded, right? And he shared like crazy. So he was out there like telling story like crazy all over the place, sharing this his epic journey, if you will, right? Where he roamed around for like 8 years, saw a bunch of different people, ran into indigenous peoples here, and saw the 7 cities of gold or 7 cities of Cibola, right? And this is like one of the first accounts we have occurring here that was not connected to the storytelling and narratives and stuff like that of the indigenous peoples of the Southwest, but also what we consider like kind of like an outsider, right? And they go ahead and and start having interest in this story, right? Like 7 cities of gold, because he's like, I saw these 7 cities, they were made out of gold. They're up there. Um, I was trying to claim the land for Spain and all this stuff. And yeah, all this like weird stuff, right? Because he wanted to make sure he didn't get in trouble for like running away either, right? And so, because that's what happened, he got freaked out and ran away, and so that ended up being a big part of it, right? And so, one of the guys with him was an enslaved African guy named Esteban, right? And so he kind of like said the same thing, and so everyone was like, "Well, if there's a couple of them saying it, then it must be true, right?" And so they went ahead and took his account as truth, right? And so they really wanted to like find that gold, right? So that's where we end up seeing individuals playing a part of that. So hold on, I'm sorry. So one of the things that occurs is that they end up trying to make their way up north to go and find these 7 cities of gold, right? Sorry. Okay, so what they do is they start to make these expeditions up north to be able to go and find the gold, right? And the first time they're like, Cabeza de Vaca, you need to go with us. Oh no, I don't know. And like you have to remember too, like he was exposed to 8 years of like being just out. And so at some points, and he when he did, maybe he did see what he thought were cities of gold, and really they were just the pueblos. But he's also suffering from heat exhaustion and just regular exhaustion. And you sometimes when you're in that place, uh, you see stuff, you hallucinate, right? And so that's probably really what happened, because what ends up happening is they end up sending expeditions up here. Uh, First off was Fray Marcos de Niza, who used Esteban as a guide, right? The enslaved African dude. And so when they got to a certain point, um, they made it up and they sent Esteban ahead, right, with a couple of other soldiers. And if he saw gold, he was supposed to send a cross back, letting him know. But depending on how big the cross was, that's how much gold they saw. So he was a couple days journey ahead. Well, one time they see Marcos de Niza sees a horse riding back and they have a giant cross. So they're like, oh man, he found a lot of gold. Well, he ends up getting to a certain one of the pueblos here. Um, and ends up um making contact with them from a distance. They had killed Esteban, right? The people of the pueblo, because they didn't know who the heck they were. And so Marcos Zeniza gets that cross and sticks it in the ground and like claims the land for Spain and then runs back to Mexico, right? Well, when Coronado comes later on, um, in 1540, and go brings forces Marcos de Niza to try to come up here and give be a guide, right? Um, Takes them to like the same area, and they attack, right? And so when they do that, that is whenever we see the first instance of like an official um account of that occurring, right? Where that contact happens. Um, and it wasn't nice. Um, it was a pretty brutal attack um on the indigenous peoples here of Pueblo people here uh in New Mexico, right? And so that was a really interesting factor, because what happened is they tried to fight against it, right? And so the people that were first attacked were those people of the Tiwa, or who were also like Zuni too people. And so what ends up occurring is they're the first ones that make that contact, right? Here in the Southwest or New Mexico territory. That's 1540, where it's like official. And after that, everything is just marked down, right? We see these accounts all over the place. The Spanish were really intense about it too, so they really wanted to follow through with that in order to kind of to do that. Uh so yeah, so it's kind of an interesting thing there too. Um and so there's all these examples of that, right, where we see that play out. But the other thing too is like there's other influences that end up coming because of contact. And sometimes people talk about like the foods and stuff like that that are brought in and like livestock and stuff like that too. But like this is kind of different. This is a class on like literary arts and just arts in general too, right? Because it's not just tied to that. But the Spanish also did bring some of these art forms into what we know now as New Mexico, right? It's ended up being like this Spanish colonial art forms that end up being brought in. Things like woodworking and tin work, like we are really know about jewelry making, painting, right? Wood carving, but also poetry, plays, music, all this interesting stuff as well ends up being a part of it. And so those are brought in, and these are still things that we embrace today here in New Mexico. So this is like we can't deny that New Mexico is heavily influenced by art. I mean, we see it all over the place. You go to Albuquerque, we have all kinds of murals, we have art expositions, we have poetry, slams, we have music. I mean, like there's a lot just here in Albuquerque, and like think about New Mexico as a whole. Like it's a big part of who we are, and like a big influence for tourism too here, right? And so that's an important thing too. But it all starts with La Conquista because that's when it first occurs. That's when we first start seeing this play out as a major um, part of what ends up being New Mexican culture and art forms and art culture too, right? And so we have to remember too that some of these art forms were also brought by people who were not like typically what we think of as regarded as like the Spanish and the conquistadores and stuff like that that came here too. But we had most of the colonists that came in were not, I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the colonists that came in too were much like we think of like even like I love my homie Vicente Griego, who's a famous flamenco singer. Um, he's always talking about the Gitanos, who were the people that brought flamenco to Spain, right? And they were like, he says they were like kind of like the first Chicanos, right? Because they were like this example of intermixing of culture, right? And peoples. And so, but they weren't seen as being good. Like they were outsiders too, right? And just like we saw, like whenever Isabella and Ferdinand took over again, like they purged a lot of that out of Spanish society. And so like you couldn't be like practicing Islam, you couldn't practice Judaism, you couldn't be a Gitano or you would be killed and be you would end up being treated just like we saw the indigenous people here and being put to the question by the Spanish Inquisition and stuff like that. And we've heard about those histories, right? But the fact is a lot of the people that came here too, and especially that came up this far north, were some of those people trying to escape persecution from the Spanish crown too and the Spanish Inquisition. And so people like Gitanos, people like crypto Jews or crypto Muslims, right, make their way here. And so with that, they also bring some of their art too, and some of their story and some of their narratives and stuff like that too. And so we see it a lot in like the crafts that we have even here, right? Which is pretty awesome, but it's also kind of sad too, right? That they had to go through that. And then they get here and then they're even still like succumb to the Spanish Inquisition, right? And I've heard some like pretty cool stuff too. Like one of the ones that I heard that was read in a book, um, and they were talking about like how there's so many like crypto Jews that made their way up here to New Mexico, like especially in northern New Mexico, we see a lot of that. And so like science as far as science is concerned, we see this too because like my wife is involved with uh women's health, and so she does a lot. She's a works in clinic, uh, and so they deal with a lot of like cancer, right? And so like one of the things that's a giveaway or a determinant of whether someone might have cancer is uh, stuff from their genetics, right? And so some of it is genes, right? And so one of them is called the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene, right? And those of you guys that are in medicine, maybe this would be familiar to you, but people that carry that have a way higher likelihood of having cancer. And what ended up happening is, and this is another thing too, like they wrote a book about it. Like that's how crazy it was because they had all these people in northern New Mexico who are carrying the BRCA1 gene and BRCA2 gene, and that usually is carried by people with Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. Why? Because a lot of them were crypto Jews that were moving up there. Now, I'm not saying everybody that moved up there was, so don't like twist my words, but there were people that were part of that. And so they even wrote a book about how that was a big deal in medicine up north, right? In northern New Mexico. Um, but then the book I was reading was talking about how they would like use community gatherings to test people, right? And so you guys heard of matanzas, right? And so matanzas can be a variety of different kinds of community gatherings. And I'm gonna say kinds, but like they basically cook different meat. And so sometimes it might be a sheep or a goat. Sometimes even I've heard of people doing cows and turkeys, right? But a big one is pork, is pigs, right? And so in this book that I read, they talked about how um there's even instances where they would use that as a way to determine people in their community whether they were crypto Jews, right? If they would eat the pork or not. And so that's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's completely like true. I don't know all the research on it, but that was something I heard about, and I was like, wow, that it kind of makes sense. Like I could see that happening totally. But now we enjoy them just as like social gatherings, right? And opportunities to do that stuff too, right? Like we have the biggest matanza in the world happening this weekend in Belen, right? And so um that's kind of interesting. It always happens at the end of January, early February, I think. But yeah, so there's things like that too to consider. But with that said, there's also other things that were brought here too, right? Moving along. One of the things that's interesting too is this idea of like storytelling and even the reenactments, right? And so what happens is in different places around the world, especially these places that were part of colonial Spain, uh end up implementing this play or this reenactment into the culture, right? And so what happens every year, they do this little thing called Moros y Cristianos, and this happens here in New Mexico too, still today, where they do this reenactment of the battle between the Moors or people of Islam, right, and the Christians, right? And so they reenact this battle, and it's kind of funny. It's kind of like when they do like the Civil War reenactments and things like that around the world, or in the United States or other reenactments around the world of wars. Well, this happens to be one of them, right? And basically, and it's not confused with the Cuban dish, which is also very delicious. Um, but it ties to this idea of natural the nature of storytelling, and it was used to entice the newly colonized people to basically buy into the histories of the European imperialists and colonists, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to say like this. It was also kind of like scaring people, like the Christians beat the Moors, like we can beat you kind of in the same way. You know what I mean? And so like it was also kind of like to scare them. Like it was like a tactic too. I don't know if they like completely meant it to be, but like if I was then and I was like one of these indigenous peoples watching this, I'd be like, yeah, I don't want that to happen to me, right? So like you see that too, that element of it too. But it was also an opportunity for them to share an art form like a play. And this is really what happened. And that there was like there's even like kind of like a script to it, right? And so they do these reenactments, um and they're usually tied to like um the community too, so certain people will act certain parts and stuff like that. And so it's completely tied to these examples of this battle, right, that occurs. And Moros and Cristianos happens uh here in New Mexico too, like I told you before. So we still see this. It happens in all over, like in Mexico too, we see it, and other places, but here in New Mexico we have an interesting one. I'm sharing a video of you for you guys, and it was um I can't remember the name of the person who made the little short. Um, but they compiled 8mm film clips from one of these events into like a little narrative. It's pretty cool. It's only like 5 minutes. You guys will watch that. That's part of like something you have to watch this week. But it's just awesome to see how that even still is a part of like our culture here, right? Um, and so that's another thing that was kind of interesting here, that occurred in New Mexico even today, but also way back in the past, where you're talking in the 1700s is when it starts. Um, Late 1600s, early 1700s, right? Where people start doing it even more here. But it was a regular thing, right? Um, Another thing too is like music. Okay. So like Moros and Cristianos, like when they would do the reenactment, they would play music and stuff like that too. But one of the things that was important about it was music ends up being an important factor in that cultural exchange of art forms and stuff like that too. So remember, the people here were making music, so they understood it, and it was directly connected to ceremony, which was kind of a an interesting thing, because when the Spanish came and they started trying to convert people to Catholicism, what they do is they make them go to mass, right? And so at mass, music's a part of it, and it was a part of it back then too. So like there was usually like a conquistador or a priest or a friar or whatever who played the guitar, right? And so whenever they'd have mass, they'd play the guitar, and so the indigenous people were like, "What is that?" Right? Like I had never heard anything like that. Goodness, like we have our drums and singing, and we have flutes and stuff like that too. But goodness gracious, like what is that? I want to know what that is. And so people are drawn to that, right? They're drawn to that music. Well, the other thing too with that, it wasn't just about mass and hearing the music, and even the music has stories embedded in it, right? But it was also the fact that troubadouric culture or elements were also brought over with the Spanish, and troubadours. If you don't know what that is, those were like people that traveled around Europe, and mostly starting in like the Mid East and Mediterranean and Spain, right? And then making their way up to different areas. And those are those guys, like we see in the movies, like where it's like a guy and he has a lute, right? They kind of look like these dudes here. And this guy is like an old ass troubadour, right? And so they write they do a lot of this, like walking around playing songs. Usually they were critical of several things, usually critical of the government. They were love songs too. Troubadours were wild because they used to get kind of run out of everywhere. And basically what they did, they were composers of music, but they also performed old um Occitan Occitan lyrics. And so this was like poetry, and it was directly connected to old Arabic poetry, that was even like now, like when we connect it, it's like written in Spain, right? And then makes its way over here. And so those tunes that come over with them. And so they start singing songs, and then even some of those old songs, but then they start to write songs too, right? And so that was another thing. So we get to see them participating in that as well. And those examples of how like even the art form of music ends up being a big part of it. The one that you're gonna read in the book that I'm kind of referring to now is La del Gardina, um, which is a song, right? And it's an old song, and so we still hear people sing it here, even in New Mexico. But basically, it's about some pretty crazy stuff. I'm not gonna go over too much of it because I want you guys to like read the lyrics first and then like kind of think about it too. But it's like about incest and like um weird crap like that. So it's kind of strange, and getting married like at a young age and all this stuff, right? And so there's all these elements to it that end up being like a sad story, I guess you could consider, but in a song form, right? So telling this story. And that's what troubadours did. They told stories. So they were just like we had the storytellers of indigenous groups here. And sometimes it was connected to music. the troubadours were people that did that too, right? And we have troubadours that live after, right? And so people that do corridos, and because that's what they are. That's just troubadour culture. Those are remnants of it, right? But now we still keep it around because it's about telling a story, right? Or even like mariachis and people like that too, where it's about that. Even modern songwriters, like a lot of songs we hear now tell stories, and that's because of the troubadours of the past, right? Like those things, those elements stayed within songwriting, right? And so that's kind of an interesting thing too. Um, but the other thing too is like you have to remember, like in the story, like I like plugging this in too, like because when you're gonna read it and there's gonna be some stuff that they talk about and things like that. Um, but incest was not against the law in Spain as long as it occurred consensually. They didn't care. Um, the other thing too is like pre-contact women here in Central America and the Southwest usually didn't marry until after they were 20. In in Europe, didn't matter. They could get married when they were children, right? And so that was another thing too that was kind of weird. And they kind of talk about a little bit or brush on there. But you'll read some of these things. Some of the other things that you're gonna read too are going to be a accounts, and even some of them are like eulogies and things like that too, because that's what a lot of it was then. I'm gonna stop the share real quick so I can share some other stuff with you guys too. Um, but yeah, so that was some of the things that they did as well. I wanted to go to our Canvas module real quick so you can see what's up this week too. And so your readings here, there's Tesoros. That one's you're reading page 2 to 12, I think. So make sure you get that done. There's that Moros and Cristianos video that you'll watch. It's like 5 minutes. This week you're gonna do a free write, and this I love. I'm really excited. Remember I told you guys at the beginning, like I'm excited about your assignment this week, and we're gonna kind of do some other ones. And like the first one, I want you to just like feel comfortable and get used to it, and then later on we're gonna do some that we actually share with everybody in video discussions, right? But this first one is just gonna be kind of simple. What you're gonna do is you're gonna use the readings, discussions, and video audio that we had in class to do a free write. You're going to focus on what stuck out to you from La Conquista and the written pieces that were done, and you're going to create a written piece of your choice. So you can write a poem, you can write a song, a short story, a reflection, letter. I don't care. Whatever you want to do. You can talk about praising stuff, scolding stuff, purging stuff, honoring things, whatever you feel will help you to better connect to the literary works that were discussed in this section or this module, right? So that's going to be your assignment. You don't have to, like, I'm not telling you like you have one time period to do it. Take as long as you want, okay? You can break it up too, like you don't have to do it all in one sitting. Sometimes people get confused whenever you talk about free writes like that. The other thing that you're going to do too is you're going to do I'm starting this one too, and I used to do this when I taught the class in person. It was like a inspiration forum too, and so it's basically a discussion post. This one is not video. It's just you are going to share something that inspired you this week, something that could is considered like a literary work. And like to me, that also includes videos and stuff like that too. It could be a poem, any kind of art form too, I should say that. So like even a photo, something that like inspired you in some way, right? Um, and you're going to share it in here, okay? So you're sharing these inspirations to help inspire other people too. So share this in here. You do have to respond to somebody else's, so please make sure you do that. So you respond just to I just really ask you to respond to one person usually. There's not that many of us in here, so I'd like for you to respond to at least one. If you respond to more, that's fine, okay? um but just like share that inspiration with us, right? We want to know about it. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to write like a whole big old paragraph or whatever. Just tell us what inspired you. And then if it's a video, share with us, a song, share with us. If it's a piece of poetry, share the poem with us, stuff like that. All right. That's what's going down this week, besides your readings and stuff like that too. All right. Um, well, I hope you guys enjoyed this talk. There's so much stuff I mean, this is something that could last for a long, long time if we really wanted to, but I want to make it simple and just light. So hopefully it resonated with you or inspired you or had you connect with certain things, or you learned something you didn't know. But thank you for listening. Thank you for being in my class. Um, I appreciate you. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I look forward to reading some of your work. Um, cool. Well, enjoy your week. Bueno, bye.